So this time around, we want to change this button, which currently just displays a search form to search for availability. We want to change that so that it, behind the scenes, sends a request to the server to check for availability, and the server will send back a JSON response. And JSON we'll talk about more in just a moment, but it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. We wanted to do that without ever leaving this page, so we don't have to do a full page reload, which will make things ever so much faster. So we're going to do this in a series of steps. And the first step, which we'll cover in this lecture, is actually to create a handler that this form will call. We're not going to call that till the next lecture, but we're going to call it. So first of all, let's think about what we're going to do. We want to call this form, and we want it to send back a response in the form of JSON. Now, you may never have encountered JSON, and it's not that difficult. Here's an example of a JSON file, and this is exactly the format I want to send back. So JSON is wrapped in curly brackets like this, and here is the parameter name or the value name, and here's the value that's associated with OK. So obviously, if we send a request to search for dates, that handler should take the dates, should look at them, and decide whether or not the room is available on the dates in question. If it is available, it should set OK to true, and then give a message like available. Or if they're not available, it should say OK is equal to false, and send a message not available. And that's just for an example. If we wanted to have a third parameter, like something else, well, we just give it a name, followed by a colon, the name is in quotation marks, and then some value, which might be 100 in this case. But we're not going to do that. We're going to go with the straight two values that we have to set here. All right, so let's go back to our code, which is way over here in Go, and let's stop the application if it's running. And we're going to create a new handler. So I'll create the handler first, and I'm going to give this a name, and I'll put it near post availability. Now, just for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to make this handler, which I'm going to call availability JSON, like that, and then I'll change my comment and change my comment here to say that it handles request for availability and sends JSON response. Okay, and I don't want to do any of this stuff in here. So there's my handler. Okay, and I better spell request right. So that's my name. Let's go back to our roots file and create a root to that, which I'll put right here. And I'm going to put these all on their own lines, their own block, just so things are a little clearer. So we have this one that I've just duplicated is going to be calling a different URL, obviously, otherwise it will never match this root. And I'll call this JSON. And the handler it's going to call is availability JSON. So I now have a link between, but I'm going to make this a get for right now. We'll change it back to post later. When someone makes a GET request to this URL /search-availability-JSON, it calls this handler, and I'll get there right here. Now, what am I going to do in here? I don't want to build a web page. I can't send back straight text. I actually want to build a JSON request. And the nice thing about this is that Go makes it remarkably easy to generate JSON. And we do it by defining our own type, or using a type if we haven't already. I'm going to call this JSON response. And I'm going to leave it lowercase because I'm never going to use this outside of this package, the handlers package. So it's a JSON response. It is a struct, and we just describe what we want our JSON file to look like. Now, if you go back to that JSON file that I was showing you a minute ago, we have two values, OK and message. Well, we can't use those as names because one of the rules, if you want to export a struct to JSON, is that the member names have to start with a capital letter. They have to be exported, in other words. So I'll call mine OK, and it's going to be of type bool, for Boolean. And then the next one is actually message, so I'll just call that message. And that's just going to hold a string. Now that is not enough. Technically speaking, it is, but you need to get in the habit of actually explicitly telling Go what you want to use as the values in the JSON response. Anytime that I'm populating the value of OK, I want it to return in JSON. So I've got backticks around all of this. That's the little button just above the tab on my keyboard. So a backtick, JSON to say for JSON, then a colon, then in double quotes what you want the value to be called, or that field to be called in JSON. And I want it to be called OK, lowercase. The same way for message, for JSON, colon, in quotes, I want it to call message, all lowercase. Now if I don't specify these, Go will do its best to say, well, that probably should be a lowercase okay. This probably should be a lowercase message, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to trust it because I'm not sure that's going to stay there. Maybe 5 years from now, the Go authors will decide to change the way that they're doing that. It's unlikely, but why take the chance? It's very easy to specify those right now. So I've created a struct type called JSON response. And the convention in Go is to, when you're creating a struct like this or a type like this that you're only going to use in a couple of places, put it as close as possible to the code that uses it. That way it's easy to find. So in my function, what am I going to do? Well, right now, I want to define a response. What am I going to send back? When I say response, I'm not talking about response writer. I'm talking about what I'm going to push to that response writer. So it's not R. I'll just call it resp. And I will assign that the value of type JSON response, and I'm going to use the shorthand to create and populate the struct all at once. JSON response is my type, and in curly brackets, I'm going to set OK to true right now, and I'm going to set my message to available with an exclamation mark. And I'll format that. Good. Oh, sorry, I've created that value. Now I need to convert that to JSON and to send it back. And here's the magic that is Go. I'm going to create a response from that. I'm going to call the response out. And it might create an error when I try to create this, so I'll trap for an error, because this, what I'm going to call, actually returns two values, and you'll see that in a moment. And I'm going to call the built-in package that's part of the standard library called JSON. And in JSON, I'm going to call the method Marshall, but I'm going to call the method Marshall indent, which is a little more complex. I just want to format things so that we can see them properly. And as you can see here, this takes an interface, so it takes some value. Well, my struct is an interface because everything's at least an interface in Go. A prefix, which I'll leave empty, and whether or not to, what I'm going to indent it by, just to make it readable. So I'll choose Marshall indent. And I'm going to pass it out, no prefix, and I want to indent it by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. Okay? Then, of course, because I'm possibly throwing an error, I should check for that. So I'll say if error is not equal to nil, then do something. And what do I want to do? I'll just log print line error, which is sufficient for our purposes right now. Otherwise, what am I going to do? I am going to send my information directly to the response writer. And we did that already. We can just call the w.write and pass it out, because out is already, not out here, this should be resp, because out doesn't exist. Out is already, if you look at this, Marshall indent throws back a slice of bytes. And that's exactly what we need to pass to the writer. That's almost enough. And chances are that'll work in the vast majority of cases. But the last thing I want to do is I need to create a header that tells the web browser that's receiving my response what kind of response I'm sending it. Now, whenever you call a web page, you are automatically getting a header sent back to you by the server that says this is of type text HTML. But I want to send a type of application JSON, which is the standard header for JSON files. And I just do that before I call my write. I call wheader. And that has a method called set. And I'm going to set that to two things. The first thing is, what am I sending it? What kind of header is this? It has to be exactly like this, content-type. So this is telling the browser, here's the kind of content you're going to get. And the second argument is just application JSON. So when I do this, when I call this now, because if you look back at my roots file, if I call this using a GET request, which will change to POST before too long, but right now I just want to make sure it works. This root matches this path, or this handler, and all that does is say, here's my JSON type that I'm going to be using. So I define a struct type that I'm going to be using shortly. I create that struct type in a variable called response. It has OK for its first member. It has message for its second member. Then I say, marshal this to JSON. So this indenter, this Marshall indent, actually looks at the struct type for this and says, do you have any tags up here that tell me what to call those fields in JSON? Oh, yes, you do. All right. Then it creates that. Then I write that result as a content type application JSON right to the web browser. So let's save this. Let's put one more thing in here as well. We'll just write a log print line, log.println, and I will print out the value of out. Now I could pass it bytes, but if you actually do that, you'll see a whole bunch of codes on your terminal window that aren't going to be meaningful. So I'm going to cast this to type string, just so it looks quite readable. All right, so let's start our application. Go run command /web/star.go. Everything compiled. Let's go over to our web browser and let's change the URL up here from what it is right now to, what did we call it in the roots file? I better go make sure. In roots, I called it search availability JSON. So I'll copy that whole thing, including the slash, go back to my web browser, wherever it is, there it is, and paste it in here. And see what we get. And what I get in Firefox is I get a nice rendering of what the JSON looks like. So this says here, I have a little tab in Firefox. Chrome's probably a little different. And it shows me OK is set to true and message is set to available. I can look at the raw data and that will show me the actual message itself. OK, true, message available. Perfect. And the headers, if I look at that, it says the header types are, the response headers are application JSON. So everything worked exactly as it should. And if I go back to my Go terminal, I wrote that to the terminal window. So everything seems to work absolutely beautiful. Now if I stop the application and go back to my handler and change that to false, wherever it is, where are my handlers? There, handlers. Change this from true to false, start the application back up, and go back to my terminal or my web browser and reload it. Now it should give me the same header file, but it should give OK false. Okay, this works exactly the way that I want it to. So in the next lecture, we'll turn this back into a post request and we'll actually build the JavaScript necessary to send an XML or an AJAX request from our client, the web browser, to the server and listen for the response and take some action based upon the response we get from the server. And we'll take care of that in the next lecture, or possibly next 2 lectures, but we'll get it done.